Picture this, a life so meticulously organized that even the mail's arrival becomes the highlight of your day. That was exactly how things were for Eleanor Morgan, a 42-year-old editor who had perfected the art of solitude in her modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street. Eleanor wasn't unhappy, not exactly. She had simply grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her days, punctuated only by the occasional visit from her sister or a colleague dropping by with manuscripts. But everything changed the day the regular mailman fell ill, and a substitute arrived instead. The straight mailman rang twice this week. The third time he stayed. And in those 3 visits, Eleanor's carefully constructed world of independence began to shift on its axis. Eleanor's life before the mailman's arrival was a study in routine. She woke each morning at precisely 6:30, brewed her coffee, 1 heaping tablespoon of medium roast grounds, never more, never less, and spent exactly 45 minutes reading the news before settling into her home office. The manuscripts she edited were her primary companions, fictional characters, and their creators the main source of her human connection. Lunch was always at noon, a simple affair of soup or salad, followed by more work until 5, when she would take a 30-minute walk around the neighborhood, nodding politely at neighbors but rarely stopping to chat. Evenings were for cooking elaborate meals for one and losing herself in classic films or novels. Weekends differed only slightly, with longer walks and perhaps a trip to the farmer's market or bookstore. It wasn't that Eleanor disliked people. She had simply grown comfortable with solitude after her divorce 7 years ago. The silence in her home no longer felt oppressive but familiar, like a well-worn sweater she couldn't bring herself to discard. Her mailbox, positioned at the end of her short driveway, received its daily delivery between 2:15 and 2:30 each afternoon. Eleanor rarely intercepted the mail carrier, a woman named Patricia who had been on the route for over a decade. They exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional pleasantry when their paths crossed, but nothing more. The mail itself was typically unremarkable: bills, catalogs, the occasional letter from her mother who refused to use email, and of course, the manuscripts sent by publishing houses who valued her meticulous eye for detail and continuity errors. But on a Tuesday in early October, as the maple trees along her street began their annual transformation into brilliant shades of red and gold, Eleanor noticed the time, 2:47, and realized the mail hadn't arrived. She tried to focus on the romance novel she was editing, but found herself glancing repeatedly at the clock. At 3:12, the doorbell rang. This was unusual enough to make Eleanor pause, hand hovering over her red pen. No one rang her doorbell on weekday afternoons. She made her way to the front door, peering through the peephole to see a man in the familiar blue uniform of the Postal Service. When she opened the door, the first thing she noticed was his smile, warm and slightly apologetic. "Ms. Morgan?" he asked, consulting a small electronic device in his hand. "I've got a package that requires a signature. Sorry for the delay. It's my first day on this route." He was tall, perhaps in his late 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he used that smile often. "Patricia is sick?" Eleanor found herself asking as she signed for the package, a box of specialty teas her sister sent quarterly from her travels. "Just on vacation," he replied. "I'm Michael. I'll be covering her route for the next 2 weeks." He handed her the rest of her mail, neatly bundled. "You've got quite a few manuscripts here. Are you a writer?" The question surprised her. Most people didn't notice or care about the contents of the mail they delivered. "An editor," she replied, feeling strangely compelled to elaborate. "Freelance. I work with several publishing houses." "That sounds fascinating," he said, and something in his tone made her believe he meant it. "What kind of books?" Before she knew it, Eleanor was explaining her specialty in romance and historical fiction, the challenges of maintaining period accuracy while keeping modern readers engaged. 10 minutes passed in conversation before Michael glanced at his watch. "I should get going. Still learning the route, and I'm already behind schedule." He stepped back, that smile appearing again. "It was nice meeting you, Ms. Morgan." "Eleanor," she corrected, surprising herself. "And likewise, Michael." After he left, Eleanor returned to her office but found it difficult to concentrate. The brief interaction had disrupted her carefully calibrated day, yet she didn't feel annoyed as she typically would. Instead, she felt a curious lightness, as if a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for too long. She dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the novelty of the interaction, and returned to her work. But that evening, as she prepared her solitary dinner, she found herself wondering about Michael the mailman, where he lived, if he enjoyed literature beyond what he glimpsed in the mail he delivered, whether he was as genuinely interested in her work as he had seemed. The next day passed in its usual manner, but Eleanor found herself listening for footsteps on her porch around mid-afternoon. At 2:20, earlier than Patricia's usual time, she heard the metallic creak of her mailbox. Without consciously deciding to do so, she set aside her work and walked to the front door. Michael was just turning to leave when she opened it. "Oh," he said, clearly surprised. "Hello again. I thought I heard the mail arrive," Eleanor said, feeling oddly self-conscious. "I'm waiting for an important manuscript." This wasn't entirely true. All her current projects were already on her desk, but Michael nodded understandingly. "Nothing that needs a signature today, but there is another package." He handed her a padded envelope along with several letters. "More editing work?" "Probably," she said, examining the return address. "It's from Riverdale Press. I'm doing a developmental edit on a historical romance set during the California Gold Rush." Michael's eyes lit up. "I just finished reading a book about that era. The social dynamics in the mining towns were fascinating. All these people from different backgrounds thrown together by the promise of instant wealth." Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. "You're interested in history?" "Amateur interest," he admitted with a slight shrug. "I listen to a lot of audiobooks on my route. History, science, literature, it makes the time pass, and I learn something new every day." What had been intended as a brief exchange to collect her mail turned into another extended conversation. Michael shared his thoughts on the last historical novel he'd enjoyed, asking insightful questions about Eleanor's work and the publishing industry. She found herself explaining the difference between copy editing and developmental editing, surprised by his genuine interest. When he mentioned his favorite author, coincidentally a writer whose work Eleanor had edited, she felt an unexpected thrill of connection. "I should let you get back to your route," she finally said, noticing that nearly 20 minutes had passed. "Right," Michael said, seeming reluctant to leave. "I'm still learning the most efficient path, but this was a nice break." He paused, then added, "Maybe I'll see you tomorrow? I have another package that might be coming for you." "I'll be here," Eleanor replied, and was startled by the anticipation she felt at the prospect. That evening, Eleanor's routine felt different somehow. As she cooked dinner, a more elaborate pasta dish than she would normally prepare midweek, she found herself replaying their conversation. It had been so long since she'd had a discussion about books and history with someone who shared her enthusiasm. Her colleagues in publishing communicated primarily through email, and her sister, though loving, had little interest in literature. Michael's observations had been thoughtful, his questions perceptive. Eleanor realized with a start that she was looking forward to tomorrow's mail delivery in a way that felt almost foreign, a ripple of excitement in the calm pond of her life. The following day, Eleanor found herself checking her appearance in the mirror before the mail was due to arrive, something she hadn't done for a simple at-home workday in years. She had chosen a blue sweater that her sister once said brought out the color in her eyes, and had even applied a touch of lipstick. She felt slightly ridiculous. He was just the mail carrier, after all, but couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation as the clock approached 2 o'clock. When the doorbell rang at 2:15, Eleanor waited a deliberate 10 seconds before answering, not wanting to appear as though she'd been waiting. Michael stood on her porch, this time in a rain jacket over his uniform, droplets of water clinging to his hair from the light drizzle that had started that morning. "Special delivery," he said with a grin, holding up a small box. "Needs a signature again." Eleanor invited him in out of the rain while she signed for the package. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered impulsively. "Or tea? You must be cold from being out in this weather." Michael hesitated, clearly weighing the offer against his schedule. "I probably shouldn't, but a quick cup of coffee would be amazing. It's been a long, wet morning." In her kitchen, Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, brewing fresh coffee while Michael talked about the challenges of delivering mail in inclement weather. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd visited, and gradually, more personal topics. Eleanor learned that Michael had been a literature major in college before financial realities led him to the postal service. He was divorced, like her, had no children, and lived in an apartment across town with an elderly cat named Hemingway. "I never planned to be a mail carrier," he admitted, warming his hands around the mug. "But it's steady work, and I get to be outdoors, meet interesting people." He glanced at her with that warm smile. "Like you." Eleanor felt a blush rising to her cheeks, something that hadn't happened in years. "I'm hardly interesting," she protested. "My life is rather predictable." "Sometimes the most interesting stories are found in the quiet lives," Michael replied. "The ones that seem simple on the surface but have depths most people never see." There was something in the way he looked at her, really looked at her, that made Eleanor feel truly seen for the first time in years. Not as an efficient editor, not as a divorced woman living alone, but as a person with thoughts and feelings and stories worth hearing. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Michael glanced at his watch reluctantly. "I should go? I've already stayed longer than I planned." He rose, thanking her for the coffee. "Tomorrow's my last day on this route before Patricia returns. Maybe we could have lunch?" "My treat, to thank you for the coffee." The invitation caught Eleanor off guard. Lunch meant extending their interaction beyond the context of mail delivery, beyond the safe parameters of their current connection. It meant acknowledging that whatever was developing between them had potential beyond these chance encounters. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with the immediacy of her response. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. She lay awake, replaying their conversations, analyzing her reactions, questioning her judgment. Was she reading too much into simple friendliness? Was Michael just a naturally gregarious person who made everyone feel special? Or was there something genuine developing between them? A connection that transcended their brief acquaintance? The questions circled in her mind, accompanied by both excitement and apprehension. It had been so long since she'd allowed anyone new into her carefully ordered life. The prospect was both exhilarating and frightening. The next day dawned gray and stormy, with rain lashing against the windows and wind bending the maple trees along the street. Eleanor tried to focus on her work, but found herself checking the clock repeatedly as the afternoon approached. By 2:30, with no sign of Michael or the mail, she began to worry that the weather had delayed the deliveries or, worse, that he had reconsidered their lunch plans. At 3:45, just as she had convinced herself he wasn't coming, the doorbell rang. Eleanor opened it to find Michael standing on her porch, completely drenched despite his rain gear, holding a sodden mail bundle wrapped in plastic and a paper bag that was disintegrating in the downpour. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he said, water dripping from his hair onto his face. "The storm flooded part of my route, and then my truck got stuck, and I had to wait for assistance." He held up the deteriorating paper bag. "I brought lunch, but I'm afraid it's a lost cause." Eleanor couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. "Come in before you drown," she said, stepping aside. "You need dry clothes and hot food, not necessarily in that order." Michael hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. "I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Eleanor assured him. "It would be inhuman to send you back out in this weather, at least until you've had a chance to dry off and warm up." She found an old sweater and sweatpants that had belonged to her ex-husband, left behind during the divorce and stored in the back of her closet, and directed Michael to the bathroom to change. While he was gone, she quickly prepared a simple lunch of soup and sandwiches, her mind racing with the implications of what was happening. This was no longer a brief conversation on the porch or a quick cup of coffee. Michael was in her home, wearing clothes she had provided, about to share a meal at her table. The boundaries between mail carrier and recipient, between casual acquaintance and something more, were blurring with each passing minute. When Michael emerged from the bathroom, the borrowed clothes slightly too small but dry, Eleanor was struck by how right he looked in her home, as if he belonged in her kitchen with its warm yellow walls and herb plants lining the windowsill. They ate lunch at her small table, the conversation flowing as easily as it had the previous days, but with a new level of openness. Michael spoke about his dreams of someday returning to school, perhaps teaching literature to high school students. Eleanor shared her own unfulfilled ambition to write a novel instead of just editing others' work. "Why haven't you?" Michael asked, his expression genuinely curious. "You clearly understand what makes a good story." Eleanor considered the question, realizing she had never fully articulated the answer even to herself. Fear, I suppose, she finally admitted. Fear of failure, of rejection. Fear that I might pour my heart into something only to discover I don't have the talent to match my appreciation. Michael nodded understandingly. I think most creative ambitions are held back by fear. But consider this. You've spent years helping other writers improve their work. You've developed an eye for what works and what doesn't. You probably have advantages most first-time writers would envy. His confidence in her abilities, expressed so matter-of-factly, touched Eleanor deeply. When was the last time someone had believed in her potential rather than just her competence? When had anyone last encouraged her to reach beyond her comfortable expertise into the uncertain territory of creation? Outside, the storm continued unabated, the rain drumming against the windows and the wind howling through the trees. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing in Eleanor's heart, a tumult of emotions she had long kept at bay. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still the rain fell. Michael called his supervisor to explain the situation, and they agreed it would be dangerous for him to continue his route in such conditions. I should probably call a cab, Michael said, looking out at the darkening sky. I've imposed on you long enough. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor found herself saying. The roads are flooded, and it would be irresponsible to send you out in this. I have a guest room. You should stay. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning beyond the practical offer of shelter. Michael's eyes met hers, and in that moment of connection, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a door opening. If you're sure it's no trouble, he said quietly. I'm sure, she replied, and was surprised by how true it felt. They spent the evening talking, sharing stories from their lives, discovering connections and commonalities that seemed improbable given their different paths. Michael revealed his passion for classical music, his volunteer work at a literacy program, his close relationship with his elderly mother. Eleanor spoke of her love for gardening, her collection of vintage typewriters, her yearly solo trips to different national parks. As the hours passed, the distance between them, physical and emotional, gradually diminished. By the time they said goodnight, Eleanor standing in the hallway outside the guest room door, something profound had changed. The straight mailman who had rung twice that week had stayed for the third time, and in doing so, had somehow managed to deliver something Eleanor hadn't even known she was missing, a sense of possibility, of connection, of life beyond her carefully constructed solitude. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in her kitchen. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back. Michael was still here, in her home, making what sounded like breakfast, judging by the aroma of coffee and toast wafting up the stairs. She dressed carefully, aware of a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Michael at the stove, scrambling eggs with deft movements. He had found her apron, a whimsical gift from her sister with well-seasoned, emblazoned across the front, and was wearing it over his borrowed clothes. Good morning, he said, looking up with that warm smile that now felt familiar. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you for your hospitality. Not at all, Eleanor replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. It's nice, actually. I can't remember the last time someone else cooked breakfast in my kitchen. They ate together at the table, morning lights streaming through the windows, illuminating a world washed clean by the storm. The conversation was easier now, comfortable in a way that belied their short acquaintance. When Michael spoke of his plans for the day, returning to the post office, explaining the interrupted deliveries, catching up on his route, Eleanor felt a pang of regret that their time together was coming to an end. Patricia returns tomorrow, Michael said, watching her face carefully. So I'll be back on my regular route across town. Eleanor nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. Of course. Well, it was nice meeting you, Michael. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both bold and natural. I don't want this to be goodbye, Eleanor. These past few days, talking with you, getting to know you, it's been the highlight of my year. I know it sounds crazy, given how little time we've spent together, but I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Eleanor's heart raced, hope and fear battling within her. It's not crazy, she said softly. I feel it too. Then have dinner with me tonight. he said. Not here, not as your temporary mail carrier or storm refugee, but as someone who wants to know you better. Someone who thinks you're remarkable and wants to see where this might lead. In that moment, Eleanor saw two possible futures stretching before her, one in which she retreated back into her comfortable solitude, preserving the safety of her routine but missing whatever potential lay in this unexpected connection, and another in which she took a risk, opened herself to possibility, and stepped into the unknown with this man who had quite literally appeared on her doorstep. Yes, she said simply. I'd like that very much. As Michael left her house that morning, promising to return that evening, Eleanor stood in her doorway, watching him walk down her path. The straight mailman had rang twice that week, and the third time, he had stayed, changing her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. In those 3 visits, he had delivered not just mail, but possibility. Not just conversation, but connection. Not just momentary companionship, but the potential for something lasting and real. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, a smile spreading across her face. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, her heart open to whatever might come next. The carefully ordered routine of her days now seemed less like a comfort and more like a limitation she had imposed upon herself. Michael's presence had reminded her that life's most precious deliveries often arrive unexpectedly, requiring only that we be brave enough to sign for them and bring them into our homes. As she returned to her office, Eleanor opened a new document on her computer. For years, she had edited other people's stories, helping them find their voices while keeping her own silent. Today, inspired by a connection she hadn't sought but now treasured, she began to write her own story. The cursor blinked on the screen, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, like possibility, like hope. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to type. The straight mailman rang twice this week. The third time, he stayed. Total _char_count, 18,614.